Okay, so let's get started. Thank you everybody for tuning in. This session is brought to you by the Motivation SIG. Okay, thank you everybody for coming. This session is brought to you by the Motivation SIG. SIG stands for Special Interest Group, and it is under the International Association for the Psychology of Language Learning, IAPL.com, which is a non-profit association. Today we are interviewing Professor Tammy Gregersen. Let me read you a little bit about her. Tammy Gregersen is professor of TESOL at the American University of Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. She has published extensively on positive psychology, language teacher, and learner well-being, individual differences, teacher education, and nonverbal communication in language classrooms. She was awarded 2 Fulbright Scholar opportunities in Costa Rica and Chile, and loves exploring new cultures. As you can see on the screen, we are today discussing one of her publications, the title of which is I Can See a Little Bit of You on Myself, a dynamic systems approach, the inner dialogue between teacher and learner selves. This chapter was published in a book published a few years ago called Motivational Dynamics in Language Learning, edited by the late Zoltan Dörnyei, Peter MacIntyre, and Alastair Henry. You should find the link to this chapter in PDF format in the chat if you want to check it out. So, Tammy, how are you today?
I'm fine. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I can't wait. Share my enthusiasm.
Yeah, so how is the UAE today? It's National Day, right?
It's National Day, 51 years of unification of the 7 Emirates. Yep, and everybody's so happy. Yep, very nice.
Okay, let's crack on then. So, regarding this chapter, you know, not everybody has read this chapter or had the opportunity to. They can read it. The link is there in the chat. So, briefly, what is this chapter about, and what findings did you have in this paper?
Okay, great. You know what? Okay, first of all, I want to say something, a huge shout out to 2 colleagues who have passed in the last year. And it's a huge loss to the discipline, because I would never have been able to write this without the work of Zoltan Dörnyei, who really was a huge prime mover in the whole idea of complex dynamic systems theory. And then Elaine Horwitz, who talked a lot about the emotion, particularly the anxiety of language teachers, especially when it wasn't their first language. And there's a lot of that kind of stimulated my interest in this. And of course, a huge shout out to the still living Peter MacIntyre, who I co-authored this with. So I wanted to start with that. So, okay, let me tell you what we did here. It has to be one of the funkiest, and that's another reason I chose this one. It's got to be one of the funkiest research designs that we've ever put together. So here's what we did. We were very interested in the idea of emotional contagion. You know how when you get into the classroom as teachers, if your students are kind of low, then you get in there and you're kind of like, or if you go in strong, then everybody, and you bring them up. There's this emotional contagion that exists, and we know that. I mean, it's well documented with previous literature. But what happened is that we were really curious about what happens with teachers who are also learners. So everybody who doesn't speak English as a first language, but who teaches English is a learner and a teacher. So for example, I happen to be, I was born in the United States, and I was born into a family that spoke English. And so English is my first language, and I learned Spanish. And so if I were going to be a teacher of Spanish, I would be a learner as well the whole while. That's not to say, of course, that I'm not learning English as I'm going along through life either. I mean, I do pick up new vocabulary once in a while, especially when I read Al-Hoorie. I pick up all kinds of new vocabulary, right? But anyway, so we were very interested in this emotional contagion idea. And then we started thinking about, well, what happens when the teacher is a learner, or the learner is himself or herself a teacher? And how does that psychology interact? Remember that we're the psychology of language learning and teaching. And although all of us none of us are ever going to say that we are just, individuals and that our context doesn't affect us. So of course we've got the sociology of it too. But particularly we were interested in the psychology of teachers as learners or learners as teachers, because they go both ways. And so Peter and I were like, well, how can we work with this? So what we decided to do was I did this on the Fulbright to Chile. So I was teaching a class on language assessment. And it was already a really funky class because I was all over the whole idea of alternative and authentic assessment, particularly in a conservative educational system like Chile, right, where you've got a lot of standardized tests and everything is, pretty cut and dry, and you've got, true, false, multiple choice. And I was trying to tell these teachers, oh, no, we're going to do a lot of authentic and alternative stuff here. So that's where my head was. But what we decided to do was we were looking at Dörnyei's L2 self system. And he had this really amazing 5 steps of working towards creating the vision of your ideal self. Remember that he said, when we're talking about motivation, that the more explicit, the more vivid you can create that future person that you want to be, the more attainable it's going to be and the more motivating it's actually going to be. So he came up with 5 different steps of how to get there, starting with creating the vision and then strengthening the vision. And there were 5 different steps, and I can go over those in a minute if anybody's interested. But what we did was we created 5 different activities. And every other night, they would do first they would do one activity in creating the vision, and they would do that as a learner. Okay, so that was the first class. And then the second class, they would do it as a teacher. So they were imagining themselves, making their future vision of themselves as a learner, and then the next night as a teacher. The second step they would do as a learner, and then they would do as a teacher. And then the third step, they'd envision themselves as a learner, and then they would do it as a teacher. And then they would write these dialogues back and forth to themselves. So the learner would do it, and then as the teacher, they would do it, and then the teacher would respond in a dialogue journal to the learner, who was actually themselves. So essentially what we were doing was we were getting the narratives of people talking to themselves. It was just the most amazing data that I've ever seen. And in fact, it got to the point, where they would actually say, they would say you. So they would use second person to refer to themselves as a learner. And so it was the data, and I'll share some of the data. It was just so much fun. So what did we have? We had these sets of narratives of learners and teachers talking to themselves after having done these activities of creating their ideal selves visions. Okay. And then at the end of the series of activities, they did a self-reflection. And so we had those 10 narratives, 5 as learner, 5 as teachers, and then we had their ultimate self-reflection. And we took that data, and it was an immense pile of data. You wouldn't believe. I mean, if I don't have the exact number of the corpus, but it was huge. And when Peter and I looked at that corpus, we thought, oh my God, who's going to code that? But anyway, we did, we coded it. And we used a deductive approach, okay? So what we wanted to do was we wanted to see how dynamic it actually was. So let me tell you the actual research question. Our research question was this: what does a study of the internal dialogues of teachers as learners tell us about the L2 self system of teacher learners as interpreted through a dynamic systems framework? Okay, so now you got the idea. We've got this data of people talking to themselves, right? And then, so what we did was, with this data, we took 8 different tenets, or tenets, if we use French, of what is dynamic systems, of what are ideas within dynamic systems. And I'm going to go through those for you because you'll need to know what those are. So we wanted to find out, so we went through the data and we coded it looking for evidence of these ideas of dynamic systems. So the first one was, one of the first things, and this comes from Diane Larson Freeman's work, okay? So we took her definition of dynamic systems and we used number 1, for example. Variables in the system are innumerable, interconnected, and in constant change. Ooh. Ooh. So what does that mean? So what we did then was we went through the narratives and we tried to find evidence of these voices of people, of their voices of teachers and learners finding their ideal selves, to see if we could find innumerable, constantly changing variables. And we did, right? We found some, I mean, if when you go through the paper, you're going to find that we gave, for every variable, we found, some of our most favorite ones, and we were able to show definitely all of these different variables. The second variable we looked at was the system changes over time and is composed of multiple interacting timescales. Now, this is one of my favorites, okay? Because if we think about language learning, as particularly as a teacher trainer, we can think about motivation, right? We can think about why, like if we go back to Gardner, way back in the 80s, we can go and ask his question: why do people want to learn a second language? I mean, is it for instrumental reasons, right? Is it for integrative reasons? But we can also ask, and so that would be a long time scale, right? Because I mean, it's why, and that carries with you throughout your whole language learning experience. But then you've got, process-oriented ideas. Dörnyei and Otto and all of, when we take a look at classroom experience, it could be that we're motivated from moment to moment. Like, I'm really engrossed with what the teacher's just saying right now, but then, oops, you know what? My attention got diverted from somewhere else. And then I'm, my motivation drops off until something else brings me back. So there can be a moment to moment. And that's where we work a lot with ideodynamic, right? We can work with what we do with Peter with ideodynamic, where we look at people's motivational changes from 1 minute to the next. But then you can look at it also. I mean, how many of us are teachers, right? We can look at it over a class period, right? Right. I had them for the first 15 minutes, but then something happened. Oops, I changed my activity up, and the first activity went great, but lost them after the second one, right? And so there's these over a period of a class time too. There's a motivational dynamic, right? You could talk about from week to week, right? First period. This is the first class of the semester. Everybody was raring to go. Let's take a look at that syllabus, everybody. Woohoo! This looks like it's going to be a great class. Then you get to midterm and it's kind of like, oh gosh, I'm almost halfway through and I'm really almost done. And then you get to the end of the semester and it's like, I can't believe I'm almost here. I almost made it, right? So then you can look at it through a semester. And then you can look at it over over maybe you're going to be it's a 4-year program of language learning, of language teaching, right? You're in a teacher training program. You can look at your motivation over the 4 years of your program. And then you can take a look at it over the, these are just examples of how timescales make a difference. And we were amazed with the data that we found at concerning how our sample experienced change over time, and how they talked about it on different timescales. It was amazing how often we heard phrases like, in the past, I, or right now, I feel, or in the future, I hope, right? Because we're asking them to look at their ideal selves. And so in the questions we were asking, there was this idea of time, right? Okay, then we took a look also in terms of dynamic systems theory. We took a look at the next one, which was, that's dynamic systems sometimes settle into attractor states, right? That sometimes, although things are constantly changing, sometimes things get into a kind of a rhythm, right? It's just kind of, it gets into a stable system that's not always so stable, but it sits there for a while until it moves again, okay? And we found some stuff on that, some really cool stuff. And then we looked at perturbations in the system. So that means if we look at language motivation as a system and there's a perturbation there, how does the system change? And so our people, our participants, also created in their narratives how different things affected their motivation as learners, and how that affected them as teachers, and that constantly interacting teacher-learner interaction. And like if something would happen to them as a learner, right, that maybe, for example, as a learner, they hadn't mastered yet something that was really a very intricate part of the grammar, and they were supposed to be teaching that. And how did that perturbation in their learner self affect their ability to teach that? It was very interesting. So that's another idea of dynamic systems, how perturbations occur. I'm just going to go through, okay, how about this one? Okay, I'm going to do 2 more and then I'll stop and then I'll get the next question. Okay, so the other one that is fascinating to me in terms of dynamic systems and what happened in this paper was that something called the butterfly effect. And they call it the butterfly effect because they say that when a butterfly flaps its wings in Taiwan, a hurricane happens in the Gulf of Mexico. It just means that something little that you think is just something so small has an effect to make a huge change, right? Like, for example, when I got my very first job in Chile, I went to the consulate to sign a piece of paper. And who would have known when I walked into that consulate in the morning and signed that piece of paper that 5 minutes inside that consulate would change my entire life? Because you know why? I met my husband. That itty bitty 5 minutes of time changed my entire life, right? So it's like this itty bitty, wow, my whole system was transformed because of this 5 minutes of the working of this chain of signing a paper. But also the opposite happens. Something huge that you think is really huge can hit the system and there's no change at all. It's kind of like, whoa, that system was pretty stable to have that big thing knock it against it and nothing happened to it, right? And we found in the participant data, in the teacher-learner data, both of these things happening, these little itty-bitty things that made big changes. Like, I remember one participant talked about going to Canada on a trip, and it was just a 1-week trip, but that changed her entire life in that it made her want to learn English more than anything else in the world, because she had had that one experience of that little bit of travel. right? And so that as a learner actually made her want to be a teacher, right? So yeah, so essentially, Ali, the answer to your question is this. What did we find? We took a look through a dynamic systems lens at teachers who were going through activities of finding their ideal teacher and learner selves to see whether or not we could find indices or evidence of dynamic happening. Yeah. Did that make sense?
That's a very, very interesting and innovative methodology. This is the first time that I see something like this, where
Pretty crazy,
people
right?
talk to themselves in writing and then comment on their own writing from a different perspective as a teacher. You know,
Ali, would you expect anything else from me? I mean,
and you mentioned a lot of ideas like complex dynamic system theory, alternative assessments, ideo-dynamic method, attractive states. So there's so much going on in this paper. So what inspired you to do this paper in the first place?
Yeah, you know what? The inspiration actually happened. You know, when I mentioned Elaine Horwitz at the very beginning, and I was talking about how learners, and I'll tell you what it is. Because I teach English as a living, and I speak it as my first language. I am so utterly in awe of people who teach English and who don't use it as their first language. And so I admire the courage of people who say, I'm gonna take this second language that is, because I'm thinking, what would it be like for me to teach Spanish and go every day into the classroom and teach a language that I know, but that it doesn't come as naturally to me as my first one does. And so I've always had this desire to get into the psychology of the heads of teachers who do that, because I so admire that courage to do that, because I don't know if it was luck or just destiny that I speak English as a first language, and that's what I get to do with my life. And so I wanted to get into the heads of people who do it, and who do it as a second language, and to find out more about that. But the other thing I wanted to do is, because I am in Spanish we say cupuchenta. It's kind of like I want to know everyone else's business. I wanted to know about emotional contagion, and I mentioned that at the beginning. I'm fascinated by how people, how one person's emotion is picked up and transmitted to another person who picks that up and feels it too, right? And so emotional contagion is something that I'm fascinated by, and it's something I've written a little bit about, but I wanted to find out if there was anything about this emotional contagion that happened between a learner and a teacher. Because could it be my learners and I'm a teacher, or my teachers who I'm training and their learners? But could it also be within oneself? Could my motivation as a learner affect my motivation as a teacher? And could my motivation as a teacher affect my motivation as a learner? And that was fascinating to me, and I wanted to find out more about that. So that's kind of what inspired me to do it. And so essentially, we became a fly on the wall, right? We were a fly on the wall, listening to teachers and learners talking to themselves, and it was a lot of fun. But yeah, that's what inspired me. That admiration I have for people who do that, as well as the emotional contagion idea.
Yeah, that sounds a lot of fun. So when you looked at the results, was there anything surprising in your findings?
Was there anything surprising? I think Yeah. What was so surprising? Well, look, I mean, we looked at it deductively, right? And so we were expecting to find, what we were looking for, because we knew that we understood, just we suspected, of course, that all of this is so dynamic. So we expected to find the dynamicity of language learning and teaching. But I don't think we had expected to find as robust as we actually did, because every single person was able to, I mean, okay, how about this? It wasn't every single person that showed us every single tenet, but we found every single tenet as we looked over the whole gamut of the mass of narrative. And so I suppose the robustness of it surprised us a little bit. It was like, wow, this is robust. This is really pretty cool. The other thing that really surprised me was how much fun we actually had going through the activities that Dörnyei had set it up. Dörnyei had set it up theoretically, right? And so Peter and I came up with we creatively came up with the activities. And so it was really surprising to me how much they got into it and how much fun we actually had doing the activities. And I don't know how many people actually read what we did, but I think that might be fun. I mean, if I have a lot of practitioners here, I don't know the difference. I mean, I don't know how many people here are more practitioners than they are researchers or practitioners or both. But for the practitioners out there, we had so much fun. And if you don't mind, Ali, I'm going to share just how fun this actually was.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay. So the first thing, Dörnyei said that we have to actually create a vision. So we have to create a vision of the ideal self. So what we did was, okay, so we had these were teachers, remember? Okay, so we had teachers who also are learners getting into pairs and interviewing each other. Okay, and we had them share with each other their ideal selves, their ideal future selves. How do they see themselves? First, remember, we did it as learners. Right. And so the first night they interviewed each other. Who do you want to be as a learner? Imagine your future self as a learner, your ideal self. Create that image for us as a learner. And then they interviewed themselves. Okay. And then the second night, they created that image with themselves as teachers, and they interviewed each other as teachers. And then what we did was the one person had to create and mime a gift for the other person. So what happened? So for example, one teacher said, one learner said to the other learner, I want to learn language because I want to be able to experience every culture across the world. And I want to travel with my language. And I want to be able to meet new people and immerse myself in new cultures. So on the gift-giving night, the mimed gift was an airplane. I'm giving you the gift of an airplane. And so they mimed this gift, and they were zooming all over the room with this airplane. And of course, we were like children. It was just so much fun. But I mean, it was that kind of thing that we did. So then they did the next night as a teacher. So as a teacher, what do you want? And then they created their ideal selves. And then one person would mime a gift. One person, for example, wanted to be a famous researcher. They wanted because they were in a master's program. They wanted to get their PhD, and they wanted to have a world stage. And so the partner gifted as a mime a microphone. And they handed them the microphone, and then they were able to have a big stage. So it was just that was the first activity, and it was a lot of fun. And then they wrote about that. The second activity was part 2 of creating the ideal self. And in that, it was a real easy one. What we did was we had a list, and these, by the way, are in our Peter's and my first book we ever did, capitalizing on language learners' individuality. And so we had this activity of metaphor. And so we would give, the first time they did it as learners, we would give them, we had like 25 metaphors, and we wanted them to tell us, write down which of the two metaphors they were. So as a learner, are you the nail or the hammer? As a learner, are you a river or a lake? As a learner, are you a kangaroo or a koala? Right? And then the next night, they would do that as a teacher. As a teacher, are you a nail or a hammer? And then they compared those. So they looked at themselves as learners and teachers and the metaphors that they chose. And then they shared those with the group. So then the third activity, they invoked their role models. So in the third activity, they looked at role models that they wanted to model as learners and role models the next night that they wanted as teachers, because Dörnyei said that he wanted to create the vision of the ideal self. He's still in the creation. So that's part 3 of creating. And then activity 4 was guided imagery. So in this one, they created guided imagery scripts. And then they brought the whole class through their scripts. And so it was guided imagery. Everyone closed their eyes. And then as a learner, they brought them through this guided imagery. It was kind of funky. It was kind of like Rebecca Oxford, do, kind of, yeah. And then, if any of you know Rebecca, you know she's kind of into meditation and kind of fun things. I got that guided imagery from Rebecca. And then Dörnyei talks about strengthening the vision of the ideal self. No, that was the guided imagery. And then he talked about substantiating the vision of the ideal self. And this one was crazy difficult, because what we did was, what we said was, we want you to take a quiz. Okay. And the quiz was this: who is my ideal L2 learner self? Okay. And then they had to create a list of 10 things that they wanted to do as their ideal self, 10. And then what we did was we said, okay, they did it as a learner. And then we said, okay, you've got 10, cross off 3. You're not allowed to have 3. They crossed off 3. And then we said, okay, cross off another 3. And they had to cross off 3. Okay, so they were left with 4. And then we said, okay, now cross off 1. So they were left with only 3. And those 3 then were their most important ones. So they were substantiating that ideal vision, right? And they did that as a learner and then as a teacher. And then the last one that Dörnyei talked about was operationalizing it. And in terms of that, we developed a goal plan. And that was much more, with a graphic organizer, creating a goal plan. And that was, not as weird as the other ones that we did. But yeah, so we did these activities as learners and then as teachers, and then they talked about it. So some of those activities were kind of fun. So I thought I'd share some of those.
Yeah, definitely sounds a lot of fun. It doesn't look like you were teaching or just having fun with your students, and they were having fun with you.
Well, you know what, Ali? I mean, that's the one thing, if I can say something, that's the one thing that I always tell my MA students and my PhD students, that research really is fun. I mean, research is so much fun. And, we take a look at it through this idea that it's just grueling and it's just, no, you know what? Research can be as fun as you want to make it. And some of us, do kind of strange things with cool qualitative ideas. Some of us are much more psychometric oriented, but you know what? There's so many fascinating things we can do and so many creative things we can do to get the data. And I just want anybody out there who's a junior scholar to know that, research is probably one of the most exciting, now I'm sounding like a geek, but research is one of the most exciting things you're probably going to do in your entire academic life. It's as fun as teaching. It really is. Okay, now next question.
Yeah, okay. You mentioned, some, bits and pieces of what your participants said. Is it possible to share an excerpt or two to?
Yeah, actually, I have some faves. Okay, I have some faves. And now you're going to see what I mean when you read, when you hear some of it from their own voices. Okay, so here, this one was in response to variables in the system are innumerable, interconnected, and in constant change. I mean, listen to how incredibly this is aligned with that tenet of complexity. I really think that both my learner and teacher motivation not only interact, but also they provide feedback to each other and help me to improve as a student and as an English teacher. Another person said with the same tenet or the same idea, my conception of a teacher is that of a person who never stops learning. In this sense, I see the teacher as someone who has a dual role, someone who must never stop seeing himself as a learner too. I am very critical of my own performance and what I do in the classroom. I always end up my lessons by thinking of what were the things I did right and the improvements that I should apply. When I work on all these improvements, my role as a learner puts itself into practice. That is the point when I see myself as a learner who is trying to investigate about many things, correcting, editing, improving, and getting new information. Pretty cool, huh? How about, I'll give you another tenet, whatever we want to. Okay, this one is in response to attractor states, that dynamic systems settle into attractor states. Listen to this one. It is probably quite difficult to achieve my goals as a language learner, but not something impossible. I feel I am doing what I have to do in order to improve my L2 skills. Besides, I feel this second language is my own now, something no one can take away from me, and a language that provides huge opportunities of new life experiences. It was an activity that asked goals and dreams of your ideal self, a person I have been thinking a lot about lately. That is so cool. That is so cool. Okay, just I'll give two more if I can find them. Just a second. Oh, this is a little bit long, but this one is in response to, this one is in response to the butterfly effect, where little things make a big difference. Through this activity, I recalled one of the main reasons why I wanted to be able to speak English when I was a child. To travel to an English-speaking country and to successfully communicate with English native speakers. When I was 12, still a child, but a bit older, I had the opportunity to travel to Canada, and I remember me feeling very happy about it since I was going to be able to communicate with people whose mother tongue was English. Guess what happened? Since my level of English was too low, I couldn't achieve my goal. It was very difficult for me to understand English, and it was even more difficult to make my mouth utter a word. When I came back, I started to pay more attention to my English teacher, and I became very motivated about improving my English skills. I haven't stopped since then and hope I never will. And then she writes to herself, "Dear learner, how interesting it is to see how experiences that we would perceive as negative end up being good ones. And I say this because not only being able to accomplish one of your dreams as a child didn't make you happy, but this situation made you realize about the importance that effort got when improving in life." Hey, everybody, anybody who's not in the positive psych SIG, what you just saw there was finding a silver lining. That was called cognitive reappraisal, taking something awful that's happened and making something good of it, right? And I was telling Ali that, you know, one of the amazing things that has happened to me reading this paper now after 5 years of having had it published was that I want to do it again, but through a positive psych lens, because there is so much that we gathered in this paper that was motivation, but it was also like amazing things about emotion and about, you know, cognitive reappraisal and defensive pessimism, coping skills, just so much amazing stuff. I mean, we had data this much, right? Yeah. So anyway, those were some of the things that the participants shared with us. So you can see through some of those narratives that they really did get into it, and that there was some pretty cool stuff.
That's interesting, when you were based in Chile and you were dealing with Chilean teachers, and at the beginning you mentioned that context was, somewhat conservative in terms of assessment and other things. Maybe you could give us some insight into that context and a taste of it.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. You know what? Okay. So right now, I started my career in Chile, and I spent 17 years in Chile, and then I went back to the US for 17. There's something about 17 that's something, I don't know what. But so when I was in the US during those 17 years, I had the opportunity to go back to Chile to do a Fulbright. And I spent 4 months. And so what I did was I was teaching a master's class at the Universidad de Santiago de Chile. And that master's class was a class in language assessment. And I asked because they're my friends at USACH, right? And so I said, well, you know what, do you mind if I get a little alternative? I know that, that the Ministry of Education in Chile is going through reforms, but, I'm really going to be pushing some buttons here, because I'd really like to see some alternative and authentic assessment being done, because I truly believe, as a motivation person, as a person who truly tries hard to motivate learners, I really think that one of the biggest deals is the way we assess. And I think that a lot of the negative emotion and a lot of the low motivation, a lot of the high anxiety, I think a lot of that comes with assessment practices. And I think a lot of you, if you think about your own practice, that you'd agree with me, right? Even Elaine Horwitz, if you look at her three ideas about anxiety, she said that foreign language anxiety exists because of fear of negative evaluation, test anxiety, and communication apprehension. 2 of those are assessment, right? 2 of those are fear of assessment. And so if we take a look and imagine what that does to your motivation as well, we know that anxiety and motivation are very well connected, right? And so one of the things that I did when I went to Chile, and one of the things that I'm also doing here in the UAE, and I recognize that I've got a lot of Arab names on my list of participants, and I want to say thank you for coming, because I love being in the United Arab Emirates, and I love working with Arab students. But I'm teaching at this very moment, I'm teaching a class on language assessment, and I'm teaching the same kind of way with alternative and authentic assessment. And one of the things that I tell my students here in the American University of Sharjah is that when we can make a seamless transition, well, how about this? The more seamless the transition between our instruction and our assessment, the higher the motivation and the lower the anxiety. So that's to say, if we can assess our learners informally and formatively, without letting them even see that we're actually evaluating, the better it's going to be for them, right? And so that's what I was doing in Chile at the time I was gathering this data. And actually, that's what I'm also doing at this very moment, this very semester here in the United Arab Emirates. So, yeah.
That's an interesting journey. So you are from the United States, then you taught in Chile, and then you moved to the United Arab Emirates. So was there a cultural shock? How did you find the UAE?
I have to say, I love it here. I love it here, but I do have to say that they cut me a lot of slack. They give me space, because the UAE is a very loving, they're very loving people. They're very, how can I say this? They are very devout, and they know what they believe and how they feel, but yet at the same time, they give other people space to think and believe differently. And I have just been met with the most loving, caring students and colleagues that that I found everywhere else. I mean, it's super different, but at the heart of it all, just amazingly kind and generous people. And I've got the greatest students. I've got a graduate class right now. We're about 15. And I think of the 15, we've got 11 different nationalities. So, yeah.
Interesting. That's such an international class you have.
Yeah.
So as we are nearing the end of this interview, what are there any big takeaways from your study?
Yeah, the what I want, I mentioned it already, but I wanted to say it again. It's this paper, I think, I don't know when was the book published. It's been at least 5-7 years ago, and I had not picked this paper up since the last time I had to edit it. So it's been a long time since I read it, and I have a different takeaway reading it now than I did when I first did it. And that is what is so exciting, because you know what that says, Ali? It says that we're dynamic people, right? Because the person I was when I wrote that paper 7 years ago had a different takeaway than the person I am now, 7 years now. And a lot of it is because of where I've gone in my research and the move towards positive psychology that I've taken. Because remember, I have always been involved in individual differences, right? Always, throughout my entire research career. But in the past, since this paper, I've really gravitated towards the psychology of language learning and teaching, which is kind of a subsector of SLA, right? So I've become a little bit more focalized in one subset of SLA, which is positive psychology. And so when I was reading over the paper that was written specifically for the dynamics of motivation, I was absolutely floored with how much other information was in there concerning other variables of positive psychology. And so the takeaway is this: motivation is like an umbrella that has underneath it all of these other amazing things that we can, kind of not divert our attention. It's not diversion. It's kind of like a mosaic with all of these cool pieces that come together. Motivation is the big thing there. And then there's all of these, there's emotion that's a part of it, right? There's coping that's a part of it, right? There's well-being that's a part of it, right? So all of these other kinds of positive psych things. Well, you know what, Phil Hyber's here. We could talk about immunity. We could talk about grit. We could talk about resilience. We could talk about engagement. All of this is all part of this, of a subset of motivation. And so everybody here, there's so much, there's 100 million lifetimes of research that we can be doing in motivation. And I'm just thrilled to be, part of this motivation SIG, and to be able to talk to you all about this paper. Well, not just this paper, but about motivation and language learning in general.
Thank you very much, Tammy, for this. We are glad to have you here. Just in response to some of the comments, some people asked about specifics of your study. They can find all details if they read the actual chapter, which is shared in the link. Some people asked about the recording of this session. You can find it also on the link. It's currently being live streamed on YouTube, and you can still find it afterwards there. So shall we move to the Q&A, see if there are any questions?
You can put them in the chat or turn on your mic. Either way is fine.
Yeah. If everybody has questions, you can either post them in the chat or just speak up.
In person, I do bite, but on virtual webinars, it's impossible. I can only bark.
There is one question in the chat asking about some of the activities that you did with your students in that class.
Okay, okay, so that, what I didn't, okay, in the paper, they weren't really well defined, but Peter and we wrote a book for Multilingual Matters called Optimizing Individuality in the Language Learning Classroom, something like that. Optimizing language learners' individuality, or capitalizing was the word, because optimizing was the nonverbal book. Capitalizing was the individual differences. And we took the activities directly from that book. If anybody wants, you can write to me if you want just the activities. I can send you those pages from that book if you don't want to buy the book. It should be cheap now. It's been out for a while. Maybe somebody's made an illegal PDF. Lorena, you have a question?
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, I can. How are you doing?
And you?
Very well, thanks.
Just wondering, so you seem very excited about this study. So I was just wondering, have you thought of doing something similar in the future?
I do, I do, I'm working right now on some kind of funky stuff. What I did? This is something fun that I just did. I think people might find this funny. Sarah Mercer with I don't know who she was co-authoring with, but she did something. Oh, with Kyle Tabbitt. They did this paper on faking engagement, and she said, she was wondering if people faked engagement, and they didn't really get into it real deeply. They used I think Ali and Phil's ideas on engagement, because didn't you guys do some kind of meta-analysis on it? You guys, yeah. I know that I cited Al-Hoorie and Hiver on this thing that I did, but what I did was I wanted to find out how many students were actually faking it, and so we used. This is just I just finished this paper. So what we did was we filmed kids, our students, undergrads in the classroom, and then we called them to our office and had them do an ideodynamic. So what happened was we filmed them, we called them back to our office, and we had them look at themselves, and while they were watching themselves, they said, yes, we're engaged, no, we're not, yes, we're engaged, no, we're not, yes, we're engaged, no, we're not. And so then the ideodynamic software spits out a graph, and then you can see when they say they're engaged and when they're not. So we had a moment-by-moment idea of their engagement, okay? Fun. And then the cool part about that is ideodynamic is by nature mixed methods, because then you sit down and you say, hey, you say you were engaged here. Let's go back to what it looks like. Okay. Oh, but you're disengaged here. What happened? What made you disengaged? And so we were able to find moment by moment what engaged them and what didn't engage them, what made them like fake it. And then what we did, and this was the funnest part, what we did was then we called their teacher in. And then we had the teacher ideodynamically look at these students when they were engaging and disengaging. You know what the best thing about this? Teachers don't know. Teachers don't. They thought they knew their students. No, they thought that they were engaged. And then what was funny was that we knew when students weren't engaged and why they weren't engaged. And when we told the teachers why they weren't engaged, they were really funny. So for one time, just a real funny anecdote. So there was a student that was unengaged and immediately became engaged. And so we went on the video to where that was. And so we watched it. And the student said, I want you to answer your own question. The student said, go back on the tape about 5 seconds and listen. And so we went back about 5 seconds and we played the tape and we listened. And the student said, do you hear the footsteps? That's the teacher. And they immediately engaged again. It was so funny. And then another time, and now this is in the UAE, yeah? This is in the UAE, and it was very naughty. Okay, so there was a girl and there was a boy, and they were in the same group, and they were working together, and the girl was disengaged the entire time that this boy was talking. And so in the interview, we said, you were disengaged throughout this whole time this kid was talking. What was going on? She said, he and I used to secretly date. And when he was talking about astronomy, all I could think about was looking at the stars in the desert with him. And I couldn't think about what he was actually saying. Oh, sweetie.
So that's fascinating. Now, you referred to the ideodynamic method several times in this book, but some people may not be familiar with this approach. If you give us an overview.
Yeah. You know what I have to say, Ali, that it's probably one of the most exciting methods that I've had the privilege to use. Peter MacIntyre from Cape Breton University in Canada, he created this, and he created the software with his students up in Canada. And so I've been privileged to work with Peter on this, but it's, completely his creation. But what happens is that you can anytime that you can ask somebody a yes or no question, you can use it. I've used it in both teacher training and in research. So what you do is you videotape whoever your participant is, and then you bring them back to a computer. You upload the video into some software, into some ideodynamic software that you can get on Peter MacIntyre's website. If you go to Peter MacIntyre, just Google Peter MacIntyre, get his website. You can download.
Which is free to use and download. Yeah.
Yes, and it's free download. It's a free download. He's just so generous with his academic integrity. So anyway, so what you do then is you've got the software. It's so easy to use. So you upload the video into this software, and what happens is that you click for the video to run, and then with the mouse, you right click yes, left click no. So you can say, are you anxious? Yes. Anxious? No. Are you engaged? Yes. Are you engaged? No. Are you motivated? Yes. Are you motivated? No. I use it for teacher training. So what I do is, do you think your efficacy, rate your self-efficacy? And so they'll take a 10-minute part of their class, and then they'll self-rate whether or not they think they're being effective as teachers. And then I have them write a report, a moment-by-moment report on what they're doing right and what they're not, what they need to do to improve. So for example, if they lose control of a student in the back of the room, let's talk about that. What could you have done to bring that, to align that, or to engage that child, right? So there's all kinds of interesting things you can do with it. Peter has used it, and Peter and I have both used it on willingness to communicate. We also, with Phil Hiver, we did some really cool stuff on teaching learners to be more persuasive, and it was with nonverbals. So we did a nonverbal study on persuasion, which was pretty cool, and it was a strategy paper. It was a strategy paper that we brought to a conference in Greece. So we used, so that was really fun too, because remember, you've got video, so you can do a lot of stuff with nonverbals, lot of nonverbal stuff.
Yeah, interesting. There is one more question in the chat about counterbalancing the vision.
Counterbalancing, sorry?
Vision.
Oh, yeah. Okay. You know what? Let me, I'm going to have to go back to that, because counterbalancing the vision was, remember? Yeah. Yeah.
Can I ask a question with it?
Yes.
Because in the steps, in the Dörnyei steps that you were having them imagine and visualize, and I just printed that part of it because it looks really surprising for me, that they should imagine their feared self as well.
Yes.
And because now you said you're going more in the positive psychology direction. So would you still do that now?
You know, there's some, that's Elle, wow, you just hit the nail on the head. That's called the ought to self. Sometimes the feared self or the ought to self, they're not controversial, but it's like sometimes, yeah, you know what, sometimes that kind of psychology works with some people. You know what, Elle, the one thing about positive psychology that I have to say is that just like strategies, not all interventions work the same with all people. And so if you can imagine what you fear, that might be a bigger motivator than what you want to be. So say, for example, you have an ought to self. Say, for example, you're an Asian learner, for example, and you've got a huge devotion to community, to collectivism, to doing right by your family, which is a beautiful thing, right? And so there's an ought to part of your culture and of who you are. And tapping into that ought to oftentimes is a very motivating thing to do. On the other hand, other people who are ought to, you know, who are told you ought to do something like that, it's going to send them off in the other direction, because especially my oldest son, if you tell him you ought to do that, that's the one thing he won't do. So all I'm saying is that, you know, you know what, Ellie, I agree with you 100%. Is that antithetical to positive psychology? Not necessarily. Would it work with everybody all the time? I'm going to say no. Dörnyei thought that it might. Other people think that the feared self is an important part of it. You know, I think the jury might still be out, but I'm still going to hold by the fact that that not all strategies work with, not all interventions or all things work for everybody the same way.
Complex. So thank you very much, Tammy, for your time. It has been a very, very great session. Thank you. We are glad to have you today, and we hope that we have you again in future sessions. Do you have any final thoughts before we close? You
know, I just want to thank everybody for coming. And I have to say, you know what, there's nothing better in life than being a language teacher. And I know that over these past 3 years, it's been difficult, and we've been the frontline workers, right? And the idea that we're here talking about motivation, and how for all of these, you know, some people I know, for example, if you're connecting up from China, you know, I'm you know, all my positive vibes for you all there. You know, we do what we have to do, but you know what, I just want you all to stay motivated. There's nothing better in life than this. And I just want to thank you for joining us from all parts of the world. It's so exciting. And thanks for coming.
So thank you very much, Tammy. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this session was brought to you by the Motivation SIG at International Association for the Psychology of Language Learning, iapl.com. That's IAELL.com. And at the end, I would like to thank the people working behind the scenes, Meng Liu, Ashlee, Imelda, and of course, Phil Hiver for assisting with the technical aspect of this session. Thank you, everybody, and see you again in future sessions.
Bye-bye, everybody.